If you enjoy listening to adventure stories, then you should visit theDIHDERAL.com. You will find stories from other members of the community and read about climbing, life, and the outdoors. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Let's connect and climb on!
Climb on! Roll!
Welcome to another episode of the DIHDERAL podcast, and if you're a regular to the show, you know we tend to focus primarily on rock climbing and current environmental issues. So joining myself, Gaia, and Carrot,
Hi!
we have today scientist and rock climber Tessa Minicucci.
I want to give you guys a little background on Tessa. So Tessa received her Bachelor of Science from Michigan State University and did her graduate work at University of Alaska Fairbanks. She's a marine biologist with a focus on fisheries and more specifically the growth and decline of the Pacific salmon population. Tessa has participated in field studies and research from Alaska to Russia all the way to the Galapagos Islands. She is currently the Research and Evaluation Manager for the Southern Southeast Regional Aquaculture Association, better known as SSRAA. In addition to being intellectually gifted, Tessa has spent her entire life competing, learning, and guiding others in outdoor activities. The list's too long to go through right here, but among these activities are kayak guide, rock climber, scuba diver, ice climber, boat captain, cross-country runner, angler, softball, volleyball, basketball, lacrosse player. She's a connoisseur of IPAs, and of course, she brews her own kombucha. I'm not sure there's anything that Tessa doesn't do and do well. So today she joins the DIHDERAL podcast. Tessa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, and we'd like to talk about fisheries and the impact on the ocean and all of this related issues. But before we start, we would like to know what SSRAA is and what SSRAA does.
Okay, yeah. So SSRAA is one of two regional aquaculture associations in Southeast Alaska. We actually work for the fishermen, and we were started by the fishermen back in the 70s as a way to more sustainably harvest salmon in the area. Originally, the hatcheries were started by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which I might refer to as ADF&G or Fish and Game throughout, just because I use those acronyms quite frequently. My fiance is actually a salmon biologist for the Department of Fish and Game, so we talk a lot about salmon in our household. Sometimes we have to enact the no salmon rule. There's only so many hours in the day that you can talk about fish. So originally, and I can't give you the exact date, SSRAA was started in 1976, but the Department of Fish and Game started the Fisheries Research Enhancement Division, also known as FRED. And so all of the hatcheries within the state originally were started by the department as a way to, like I said, sustainably harvest fish and to kind of really emphasize not having a negative impact on fisheries. You know, Alaska kind of has the benefit of watching the decline of very abundant salmon resources down on the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, California. All of those rivers were dammed and the fish stocks really suffered because of it. So Alaska wanted to avoid a situation like that. And so SSRAA produces chum, coho, and Chinook salmon that are reared to a very small size and then released into the ocean to be caught by the fishermen.
Can you talk a little bit about what is actually happening in the oceans right now from top down? That is, what impact are we having on the oceans, and how is that impact going to in turn in the future impact us?
One really cool thing about the ocean is that we don't know very much about it. It's one of the last unexplored places in the world, in my opinion. My fiance and I like to talk about what our spirit animals would be. His would be a bald eagle, so he could fly everywhere. But mine would be a killer whale, because you would know things and see things that no one's ever known or seen before, because the ocean is just way too large for us to understand everything that's happening. So I'll talk about a very simplified version of what's going on, and that is that the ocean is getting warmer, and that is due to just increased greenhouse gas emissions, The ocean absorbs about 90% of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. And so when that carbon gets absorbed, a lot of different things happen. But one of the most obvious things that we're seeing is that the ocean is just getting much warmer. And that in turn leads to kind of these really dramatic climate events, such as, really intense hurricanes, crazy heat waves on land, and also polar vortexes of air coming down. That's all driven by the ocean. So what we're seeing as far as how it affects fisheries is that changes to sea ice and ocean temperatures are at its very bottom level, I guess. You talk about top down. I usually talk about things in terms of bottom up, because everything starts with algae and the things that are photosynthesizing. And so because of all these really rapid changes that are happening, the prey that fish eat and that animals eat is just not the same quality that it used to be, I guess. Think if you take a really juicy hamburger that you went out and you killed the cow and you're eating this meat and it's just so good, and you just all of a sudden one day the only thing you have are McDonald's patties and that's all you can survive off of. And so the energy density, so the amount of fat in the prey that a lot of fish are feeding on, is a lot lower than it used to be. And that's because of what's happening in the Bering Sea. We're seeing these really dramatic temperature anomalies where the ocean is just much warmer. And what happens is that the timing of the sea ice retreat and the timing of the phytoplankton blooms in that area, which the Bering Sea is the most productive ecosystem in the world, really, is changing so that animals aren't getting the nutrients that they used to be able to. And so you combined lower energy prey with warmer water that creates a faster metabolism, and you can't get out of the warmer water, so you need more food. It's just kind of this negative feedback loop, and is really driving a lot of the stocks collapsing that we're seeing.
So could you explain why people should care about that? So let's say you're some person and you're living in, I don't know, southern Nebraska. Why would that matter to you at all?
Well, I've never been to southern Nebraska, so I couldn't really tell you what the people there are like at all. But if anyone eats seafood, they should care, because things are not going to get better or stop getting worse even unless people start caring. This is going to affect all the fisheries, because as one fishery goes, another one is more heavily exploited. And as that one goes, another one's more heavily exploited. In addition, farmed fish also rely on nutrients from the ocean. And so I just don't think there's any way to get around it. If anyone eats any kind of seafood or appreciates oceans, they need to care about this. Even things like, might be a stretch to say that tornadoes, they have tornadoes in Nebraska, right? Those have to be related to the ocean in some way, just through wind and climate.
So I want to just kind of push that, and we'll talk more in detail about this in a little while, but what specific things are you guys doing to combat some of the issues?
Could you elaborate a little more on that question?
Yeah, what I'm wondering is what's being done to curtail some of these issues? Specifically, what regulations are you guys working on, or things are that you're doing to help get back to sustainability?
Yeah, so the organization I work for does not set any regulations, but we obviously follow the regulations that are set. NOAA is the governing body of any fisheries within the U.S. exclusive economic zone, which is called the EEZ. Every country has an EEZ that extends 3 nautical miles offshore. And so they have jurisdiction over that area. So in Alaska, NOAA, the federal fisheries management, turned it over to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to manage salmon fisheries specifically. And the goal of Alaska management, according to state statute, I believe, is to maximize the resource sustainably, but for the greater good of the user. And so that is probably unique compared to approaches that other organizations or agencies may take, because we want to sustainably harvest our fish, but we want that fish to end up in the hands of the people that need it. In Alaska, we've got a lot of different types of fisheries, but one specifically that relies on this is the subsistence fisheries, which are really heavily used by Native people. There's a lot of Native populations throughout Alaska. And down here in Southeast, we've got Alaska Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people. As you move further north, especially once you get into the Arctic, Yukon, Kuskokwim region, there's people living in these villages that have been living there, I couldn't even tell you how long, hundreds of years at least. And they have fish camps set up along the river that they rely on to harvest fish to get them through the summer, through the winter, into the following summer. That's actually how dog salmon got their name. Chum salmon are also called dog salmon, and they're called that because they're the fattiest fish. And so those fish were usually used to feed sled dogs, because that's how people got around for a long time, was by sled dogs. And so they call chum salmon dog salmon because they were primarily eaten by dogs. Now that has since changed, but that's the origin of the name. So in Alaska, in Southeast specifically, because Alaska is a large state, it's actually the equivalent of like Texas to Washington by, I guess that would be vertical distance. So down here, we're very different from some other regions, but we really try to minimize our impact on wild fish. And so hatchery fish are made to be caught. They're made to be harvested by the fishermen and sold and eaten by anyone in the world. Really, a lot of our product goes to Asia. A lot of it goes to restaurants here in America. Some of it gets canned, but those fish are meant to be caught. And so we want them to be caught, and we want those wild fish to return to their natal streams. So we use a technique called in-season management. And so we're assessing the fisheries week by week, sometimes day by day for specific fisheries. And this has really come to the forefront right now because we have a lot of restrictions and closures that have never really been seen in Alaska's state history. I mean, they have to an extent, but they don't seem to be things that people remember happening, or at least if you discuss it with fishermen or sport fishers, that's what they say. So yeah, we're really having to restrict our fisheries right now because we're seeing low returns to wild stocks. There's treaties in place between the US and Canada. We have to maintain a level of sustainability that allows enough fish to return to the stream to replace themselves for the following generation.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago fish farms, and I know that they are involved in a way with the salmon crisis. Could you please explain what they are and what impact they have had on this process?
Yes, and I think the first thing to point out is that everyone's definition is going to be a little bit different, and that makes it really hard for people to kind of understand what's really going on, because when you say fish farm, what you're imagining in your head might be different from what I say. I actually did a Google search for fish farms in the area just before this, and it showed Sarah as a fish farm. Well, Alaskans would not call that a fish farm. So I'll tell you my definition, but just know that it might vary from state to state or whatnot. So fish farms, in my opinion, are a technique used to raise a fish from the beginning to the end, basically. So a lot of these are kind of inland where there are no oceans. And so they'll create, I think for the most part, they create their own water source. I don't know of a lot of them that are like in lakes or whatnot, but I'm not very familiar with fisheries other than on the West Coast. And so what they do for salmon, for example, is they take that egg and then they raise that fish to adulthood and then they sell it as a product. Whereas hatcheries, some people here call it ocean ranching. Some people refer to ocean ranching as basically fish farms that are in the ocean. But what we do for aquaculture in Southeast Alaska is we raise for Chinook and coho, who spend usually around a year in fresh water. We raise those fish to about 25 grams, and then we release them. And so we have them for about a year and a half, I guess, but that includes like the eggs. And so salmon live to be they usually spend about 3 years in the ocean. Coho only spend 1 year. It's pretty variable from fish to fish. So once those fish, so we raise those fish to 25 grams and then we release them. Well, once they come back, they're like 12 to 16 pounds. And so our fish put on about 99.5% of their weight in the ocean. Whereas a fish farm, they feed those fish throughout their life, and salmon are just not a very sustainable fish to raise up until adulthood because they live a long time and they eat a lot of food. And so most of that food, I mean, it's usually a mixture of like poultry and other agriculture, but there is some fish in there as well. And they'll eat like 10 times as much as their body weight throughout the course of their life. So if you want to raise a 10-pound fish, you're feeding it 100 pounds of food to get it to that size. Now there's different types of fish, like tilapia, for example, is actually a pretty good fish to farm because it's a vegetarian. It matures in less than a year, I think like 9 months, and you don't have to take a bunch of food out of the ocean to feed it. So I think there's this perception that, farmed fish is more sustainable when in fact it's the exact opposite.
I want to push this a little bit. Let's say you were in charge and you could lay down a mandate as to what responsible consumerism concerning fish, specifically salmon, should be. What would that mandate look like?
Well, I try and look at these things through the eyes of someone who is not as privileged as myself, living in Southeast Alaska and able to go catch my own fish when I want to. I think one challenging thing for people is the cost, and that is unfortunate. And I think that organizations are doing what they can to keep that cost lower. But these wild caught fish are caught by people just like you and me, and that's their job, is they go out and they fish 20 hours a day and work for 6 months straight so that they can put food on the table for their own families. So there's a couple organizations that certify fisheries as sustainable or not. The most well-known one is the Marine Stewardship Council, also known as MSC. Now, there is definitely some caveats to that organization, but you're probably going to find that with most things. But when you're buying fish, you really want to look for something that says wild caught or MSC certified. And MSC certification is more important in third world countries where a lot of the fishing techniques can be really, really harmful and detrimental, such as like dynamite fishing or fishing species that live like 80 years. And so if you fish them too hard, they're just going to collapse and never recover. And so things like shrimp, those are fisheries that you should pay attention with. You should with all of them, but it's got that MSC certification on there. And then, like I said, the wild caught. But I would stay away from buying, in regards to salmon specifically, farm raised salmon. And then there's also Atlantic versus Pacific, which is another debate. But again, I would really look for wild caught Pacific salmon, because a wild caught Atlantic salmon doesn't really exist anymore.
Companies are smart. They might tag something as fresh Alaskan salmon or wild salmon without having that kind of title on there. If let's say, again, let's go back to, we'll skip Nebraska. They've had enough with their tornadoes. Let's go to I don't know, why don't we say Montana?
All right.
So let's say somebody's in Montana and they go to a restaurant and they're just like, oh, this Salmon sounds delightful. What kind of questions should they be asking? Or if they're in a grocery store, what should they say to their, I don't know, fishmonger? I don't know, whoever who sells. I guess it's a fishmonger. So
I think it is the fishmonger.
you're in Montana, and you're about to order some dinner or buy a fish. How would you do that? How would you go about doing that? How would you advise people to do that?
Yeah, so if I'm going to order fish in a restaurant, first I ask what kind of fish it is, and that usually tells you most of what you need to know. Unfortunately, you don't always get an answer. A lot of times, the people serving the food don't know where it's from. It's not a question they get very frequently, and so if that's the case, you can ask them to ask the cook because they should know. Unfortunately, for the very informed consumer, they will tell you one thing and you'll get another. Um, but I would ask where it's from, and then if it's wild or farmed. Those are really the two most basic questions you could ask. And hopefully, you're met with someone who's excited that you're choosing to be responsible in your consumption of salmon. I haven't found that to be the case, but you can always work on changing that norm.
Yeah, that's true. One time, Tessa and I actually went out to dinner together, and she asked just like she's saying right now. She's just like, what kind of fish is this? Is it wild or is it farmed? It was at a restaurant in Texas. It was at an aquarium with a tiger at it. I don't know if you remember that. But you opened up the answer by saying you would ask what kind of fish it was. Can you expand on that a little bit and tell us, knowing what kind of fish it was, what kind of information that would give us?
Yeah, so again, I wish I just knew more about fish farms, like what kind of species they raise. Because if someone says, oh, this is a sockeye salmon, well, then it probably came from Bristol Bay, Alaska, which is the largest sockeye salmon fishery in the world. If it's a pink or chum salmon, it also probably came from Alaskan waters because I don't know of any places that raise those in farms. Coho and Chinook, Chinook specifically, which is also known as king salmon, I think those are raised more. And I only say coho because they only spend a year in the ocean. So maybe farms would choose to raise something like that because it just grows a lot faster. And so that you should be a little bit more concerned about. But you can also look at the color of the meat because farm-raised salmon are usually dyed, their meat is, because salmon get their color, their red meat color from eating things like krill, or little teeny tiny shrimp. And so because that's not what they eat in these farms, they end up dyeing the meat and it ends up having a really pale color. And so it's pretty obvious. I remember one time I ordered fish. They told me it was one thing and I got it, and it was definitely not what they told me it was. And, you can't really hold it against people. There's also places where you can go buy fish labeled as something and then you test it and it's something else. That's pretty frequent. That's a fun science project to do here for a lot of the Alaskan schools is they'll go to like a variety of places and order or buy a piece of meat that's labeled as one thing, and then they'll do some analysis on it and they'll see how frequently what they told them matches what it is. And unfortunately, there's a lot of misidentification out there.
I was going to ask you this question, so you got ahead of me. Because sometimes I go to the grocery store and then I see my son loves salmon. It's his favorite food ever, which is, I don't know in Alaska, maybe all 6-year-old kids love salmon in Alaska, but here in Texas, they like their beef. So for him to say that he likes salmon, I'm proud of it. So I go get it, and sometimes I don't even know if what I'm buying, it's actually the thing. But now that you mentioned the color, I'm going to start testing it. Because it was a little pale and I feel bad. Now they tricked me. But moving forward, you recently returned from a long research expedition out to sea. Can you talk about the goal of that research and tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was invited to participate in what I would think is a very prestigious international collaborative research project with the goal of understanding overwinter survival, I guess, in the Gulf of Alaska. It's really hard to study salmon in the open ocean because they cover just enormous distances in a very short amount of time, and the ocean is very deep. And the winter is usually filled with lots of storms. And so going out into the Gulf of Alaska in the winter is just not something people generally volunteer to do. There was a lot of like ocean distribution studies done like back in the 80s, and that's where we have most of our information still about salmon migration routes out at sea. But this project was really unique. They started it last year, so I got to participate in the second year of the study. It was organized by Doctors Dick Beamish and Brian Riddle, who work for the Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which is like the equivalent to Fish and Game in Alaska, and then Pacific Salmon States. And Russia, Korea, Japan, they have the same fish we do, with the exception that they also have another species of Pacific salmon called the masu, or the cherry salmon. So there's actually 6 species. We just don't see that over here on this side. And so it just really makes sense that if we're all experiencing these wide-scale changes in ocean survival and temperature, that we should join forces, because there's a lot of really smart people out there. So why not bring them all together, since we all have the same question? And so we focused our study on the Gulf of Alaska, which was pretty treacherous. I can't even imagine going into the Bering Sea in the winter. We experienced some 25-foot seas, which is about 20 feet higher than any other seas I've experienced. And it's believed that about 1/3 of all Pacific salmon overwinter in the Gulf of Alaska. And there's a hypothesis that that first winter at sea is really what determines how many fish are going to end up coming back from that specific year class. And what we're seeing right now with this, these warmer ocean temperatures and these less nutrient dense prey, is that fish aren't able to accumulate the fat reserves that they need to survive the winter, because they're not eating in the winter. And so they're relying solely on their fat reserves to get them through until when food is available again. And so what we're doing is we're going out, we're fishing with a trawl net, which is used commercially. Ours is designed specifically to mimic the net that was used the year previously. So the first year, the research was done on a Russian vessel, and that happened because they do a lot of research like this over there. And so we relied on their expertise to do something over here as well. So the first year, they had scientists from Russia, Korea, Japan, the US, and Canada. This year, it was a smaller crew. Originally, the crew was 21 scientists, and this year it was only 12 scientists. And so we ended up having people from Russia, Canada, and the US. And so we set the trawl net out using a Canadian vessel this time, and then we do hour-long sets, and then we pull the net in and we analyze everything we catch. And so with salmon specifically, we're looking at what they're eating. So we open up their gut and see what they're eating. We're looking at where they're from. You can determine that using DNA. We're looking at how old they are, which you can do by looking at their scales. And then we're also looking at their energy density. Are these robust, healthy fish, or are these kind of skinny, sickly fish that are having a hard time making it through the winter? And so that's kind of helping us understand why we're seeing stocks crashing in different areas.
Was there any specific difference in comparison to whatever they caught the previous year to what the findings that you had this year? I mean, like there was less fish, or they were more sick, or they were more robust, or any?
Yeah, there was a lot of differences. Unfortunately, this cruise started at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic. So the study ended up being quite different from the year previous just because of logistical challenges. But we ended up catching more fish in the first 2 sets that had fish in them than all of the previous year combined. And I think this is primarily due to us just being lucky and encountering a big school of fish. Our first 2 sets, we left from Victoria, BC. Our first 2 sets were like kind of right on the shelf. So there's a shelf on the west coast there. And when I say shelf, I mean it's literally like a shelf compared to the rest of the Gulf. And so it's much shallower, and then it drops off really deep. And so our first 2 sets were empty, and then our sets 3 and 4, we got, I can't remember the exact numbers, between 100 and 150 chum, coho, and pink salmon, which was just on each of those sets. So we were all very, very excited. We hoped that this was going to continue the whole time. Unfortunately, it didn't. But it was just cool to see so many fish out there. It's like, oh my gosh, this ocean is huge, and we found fish. They were surprised to encounter sockeye in the areas that we did. And they were expecting to catch a lot more sockeye up north, closer to Alaska. Unfortunately, they didn't end up fishing up there. We had a port call. It was how many days? It was about a 30-day research cruise. And there was a port call in Prince Rupert scheduled just over halfway through. So unfortunately, once the borders closed, the Americans were told they needed to get off the boat, which probably ended up being a good thing because we all made it home. And unfortunately, the Russians are still in Canada. But because there was no American scientists on the boat, they were not able to fish in the US EEZ, which is where they expected to find kind of large catches based on the year before. But they also weren't able to fish up there because we had pretty bad weather compared to the year previously. In 2019, it was like Lake Pacific Ocean out there. It was nice and calm and flat. People were sunbathing. In 2020, I was just holding onto my bunk for dear life, trying not to die. So
the representation of how 2020 has been like so far.
Yes, exactly. It was telling.
Let's get into some more personal details about that cruise. Like, what was it like sleeping, eating? Did you get seasick? Like, how did you handle yourself?
Well, I definitely had a moment where I really questioned my life choices. I said to myself, oh, I thought I was smart, but here I am on this cruise feeling like I might die. So how smart am I really? I have been on research cruises, but they were in kind of inside, much calmer waters. And so this was my first time being on what we refer to as the high seas. And I was hoping that it was going to be better than I expected. It ended up being pretty much what I expected. I'm one of those lucky people that has always been motion sick to an extent. It's gotten much better as I've gotten older. But I can't, sit in a car and read on windy roads. It's just not something I can do. So I had motion sickness medication with me and natural stuff, prescription stuff, pretty much anything I could find. I just brought it just in case. But yeah, it was pretty wild. We were hoping we'd get out there and we'd have some moderate weather to get our sea legs accustomed. But unfortunately, we got right into a storm. And so the boat we were on, we called it a cork because it just bobbed left and right. It's called listing left and right, over and over and over. Even though it was pretty calm, we were listing. And so with 25-foot seas, it was unlike anything I've ever experienced. I mean, you can't walk. You have to just move as the boat moves. So if you're wanting to walk and the boat's rocking the other way, you're not going anywhere. You're waiting until it lists the other way so you can move. I was in the bottom bunk, and so you would literally hit the top of your bunk You had to kind of wedge yourself in there if you wanted to get any kind of sleep. And so I found that my mattress was thin enough that I could fit both my hands around it. So I'd kind of like shove my back up against the wall and then hold on to the other side. But it was wild. We were fishing 24 hours. And so we would get to a station, we conduct oceanography. So we put equipment in the water to read like temperature, depth, salinity, various things. We did these things called bongo tows, where we're trying to get like phytoplankton and really small organisms. And then we would trawl for an hour. And so once, as the Americans on the boat, we were responsible for marine mammal watch. So we had to be awake and in the wheelhouse anytime it was light out, and we had gear in the water. And so we would sit up in the wheelhouse for about 2.5 hours while they were conducting the trawl and the oceanography. And then when the net came in, we'd go down and process the catch. And there's a bunch of fish. It would take about 6 hours to process it, which is about the run time between stations. So if there's a lot of fish, you were not going to get any sleep. I would say maximum, we got about 3 hours of sleep between stations if the weather was cooperating enough for us to just go to the next one. But that first storm we hit, I think there was more people seasick than most people had ever experienced. Even the crew was sick. They had been in some trainings, and so they hadn't been on the boat in about a month, and so you lose your sea legs. And the poor cook was, in the galley cooking all this food. He'd run to the bathroom and throw up, and then he'd go back. And my biggest struggle was staying, this is graphic, but staying on the toilet because it wasn't screwed down. And so you had to like put your hands on the walls to like keep it on the bottom, because I couldn't keep anything in me for 3 full days. And so my bunkmates were amazing. They pretty much saved my life. They would bring me crackers and water, and I would eat the crackers so that I had something to throw up, and drink the water, but then I'd have to go to the bathroom. And just from walking from my bunk to the head, I would get sick and throw everything up. And so at the end of the 3rd day of not being able to keep anything in my body, I really wasn't sure what was going to happen. We were playing the game of, would you rather have COVID-19 or be on this boat right now? I definitely chose COVID.
Oh my gosh. I don't even want to know how that boat smelled, like between the fish and the throw up. That combination.
It smelled pretty good. It was very clean. It was a factory trawler. And so what that means is that they're used to catching like a ton of fish and processing it on board. And so we had a lot of our science gear. I was processing fish on the deck. And so I had the luxury of breathing in nice, fresh, salty air. Other people were not so lucky. They were down in the factory, and it only takes one clump of missed fish to make that place smell rancid. And so I don't think it was that bad compared to a lot of them, but I just had to hold my breath when I walked through certain areas.
Is it you're telling the story and I just imagine people throwing up like, bleh, like the extra, like, bleh.
Oh yeah.
That would have been me. I get very
People
seasick.
were definitely like head down working up fish, and then they'd run to the side and throw up.
Oh,
and then
no.
they'd come back. Because it was like so rocky. You could not stand in one spot. Like we probably should have just like tied ourselves to the table so that we wouldn't keep hitting things.
So this is not your only international experience. You I don't know how you express this, did some time in Russia earlier in some studies. Can you just talk a little bit about that journey from only having hairspray instead of bear spray to eating rotten fish soup for the entire journey? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, man, that's a really good description of it. A sentence. No. So when I was in grad school, we were working on setting up an exchange program between Kamchatka State Technical University and University of Alaska Fairbanks. Like I said, they have all the same fish over there and some really smart people, and the resources to be able to look at it. And so it makes sense. Why not look at fish in Alaska and compare them to fish in Russia? You could probably find out some really cool things. So I participated in it was a 4-week exchange where we went to Bristol Bay with a Russian professor and 2 students, and we were there for about 2 weeks. And then myself, my graduate advisor, another classmate, and a representative from the World Wildlife Fund came over to Russia, and Kamchatka specifically, which is the furthest east peninsula in Russia. It was actually only a 3.5-hour plane ride from Anchorage, which was wild. They have a direct flight in the summer for a few weeks because it's a really big place to go trophy hunting and fishing. So when we were there, we flew out to this remote camp. I should have known from the first second that it was going to be wild. The plane itself was, I don't know where it came from. My classmate was sitting in the emergency exit row, and his armrest was sawed in half.
I know.
Just like shards of metal sticking out. There was no alcohol out on the plane, which I was happy about. And Kamchatka has like these huge volcanoes, and so we were like really excited to see them. And I kept waiting and waiting and waiting to see them, and all of a sudden we were on the ground. So there was like no visibility landing. It was, going through customs was crazy. It was like I got yelled at for taking a picture. And then we ended up taking this Mi-8 helicopter out to the site, which is like those huge decommissioned military helicopters. And there was so many potatoes in that helicopter. I think they weighed more than the people. But if anyone's ever been in a helicopter, usually it's like, you can't take much. It's a light load. No, this one, there was like 15 people, 1 million pounds of potatoes. We were so overloaded. We had to do like 3 rolling starts to like get off the ground. And then you fly really low in those. And so it was just like, if you look out the window, all you can see is trees like right there. So we got out there, and I was kind of expecting the Russians to be, badass, like fighting bears with like, their flask of vodka and a knife in their teeth. And they're all kind of scared of bears. Like, I was really surprised. Kamchatka has the world's largest brown bears. Like our brown bears descended from their brown bears, so they're just huge. And we were told there was going to be someone out there with a gun and a boat. And we had bought bear spray, which had just become legal, and we like snuck it out there because I guess they didn't want us bringing it, but my graduate advisor was like, we're bringing it. So we snuck our bear spray out there, and so we got there and we found out that the camp had just been raided. And so there was like no beds, no lab equipment, nothing to cook with. And of course, no one is actually telling us this. Our translator really wasn't good at speaking English. And it was just like frantic, like people running around. And so finally we were able to deduce that something's not right. So luckily they gave the Americans mattresses. I was very thankful for that. But we discovered there was no gun, there was no boat, there was no minutes on our satellite phone, so we couldn't like call town for anything. At one point, so we did a lot of stream walking. So you like walk through the stream in your waders and you have your bear spray in your belt. Well, at one point the label got rubbed off the bear spray can, and the Russian students out there, there's about 10 undergrads. They speak a lot more English than they let on. I think they're just nervous about speaking it. But one of those guys was like, "Oh, hairspray."
I know.
And we're like, "What?"
Oh my God.
And he's like, "Oh, it says flower hairspray on the can." And it was like a pink can. I guess we should have known. And so we were like, "Oh my gosh." So we sprayed it. And like when you spray Alaska bear spray, it's like it's really, really concentrated pepper spray, basically. And it's got this really direct stream. And so no matter what you do, it gets in your eyes and like makes your eyes burn, even if it's facing, everything is going right as far as the wind. Well, this was like, it must have been bear spray in a hairspray can, because it was like a gentle mist and like no one's eyes were burning. So we're like, oh, like the bear would be like, cool, thanks for like giving me a hairdo.
Yeah, everybody's hair looks great.
Yeah. And so it ended up being fine. You know, we all survived. I ate a lot of fish soup, which I had not done before. You know, in Alaska, we're pretty snobby about our fish. They are not snobby in Russia, that's for sure. But the pelmenis were great. I did eat some fried milt, which is, you know, a lot of people eat roe, which are the eggs, but the lesser known counterpart is the sperm sac. And so they fried it up, and one of the women I was with was like, oh, whitefish. So she took a bite and she's like, oh
my
it tastes like
God,
whitefish.
no.
And I was like, oh snap, that is sperm. I tried it. It was creamy.
So I wanna talk a little bit about the film Artificial, released by Patagonia recently. And I know there were some things that you wanted to say specifically about that film. So I was wondering if you can kind of give us your 2 cents.
Yeah, you know, I am a big supporter of Patagonia. So let me put that as a disclaimer.
Tessa is literally wearing a Patagonia jacket right now.
Yes, a lot of my wardrobe is Patagonia. So I was very disappointed when I watched that movie. You know, I know it's easy to say like, oh, well, you work for a hatchery, so you're biased. I do work for a hatchery, but first and foremost, I'm a scientist. And so my goal is to literally be unbiased. And there's always ways to better do things, and hatcheries have made a lot of mistakes too. But I was disappointed by the film because it really presented a strong one-sided opinion on how to basically combat this global fisheries crisis. And it presented that opinion as fact, when in reality, there wasn't a single Alaska scientist on that included in that film. And it thinks that if you were really trying to present this issue from all sides, not only would you present at least one opposing viewpoint, you would ask the people who are very, very familiar and have very successful fisheries in their states, and that's Alaskan scientists. And that was not included in the movie at all. It lumped all fish production into one thing, and he even said that in the film. He's like, I don't care if you're a hatchery or a fish farm, I'm including you all together. Well, that's like saying, I don't care if you're an NBA player or a CEO, like you're all the same. It's like, no, you're not. It's not the same thing. How can you present this like educational film if you're making assumptions that are not true? And so basically the film talked about, you know, how poor salmon stocks on the West Coast are doing, and the effects that it's having on the Puget Sound killer whales and native communities. At one point, it literally correlated substance abuse in native communities to hatchery production. It's like, wow, that is a leap. Like, and yeah, it just showed, you know, all these PhDs on there, again, presenting their opinion as fact. When in reality, there is an ongoing study right now that I actually worked on before I went to grad school, looking at how hatchery and wild fish interact in Southeast Alaska. And what they're doing is they're looking at chum and pink salmon specifically, and they're even genotyping these fish. So they're saying, okay, we're going into the stream of wild fish. We're looking at all the hatchery produced fish, because all hatchery produced pink and chum are otolith marked, so you can identify them from wild fish. So they're taking all these DNA clips from all these fish, and then they're going back the following year and they're doing it all over again. So they're looking at instances where hatchery and wild fish breed and how that affects the overall fitness of that fish. So is it a bad thing that they're interbreeding? That's certainly an argument that can be made, and it's definitely the only argument that's made in artificial. We refer to this as straying, when a hatchery fish doesn't return to its correct stream, and there's a lot of reasons that can happen. But fish adapt really quickly. And so a big argument that people make is when you take a fish out of a wild system and put it into a hatchery, it quickly changes basically its DNA in a sense to become less fit. And when I say fit, I mean, think of like humans being fit, right? So you're not going to take someone, what's a good example? You're a marathon runner, Gaia. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, you're not going to take someone who is not in shape and make them run a marathon. Like, they're not going to do well, right? So same thing. You don't want to take a hatchery fish and throw into a wild stream. It's not going to do well. But the argument that people are making that was not shown is that, well, if a wild fish adapts to a hatchery within a couple generations, wouldn't it happen the same way the other way? Because as sea ice retreats, it opens up new territory for fish. So at one point, this whole area, I mean, Alaska, North America, was all covered in glaciers. And so as glaciers receded and the ice age was over, all those streams were colonized by fish that weren't from there. And that's how we have all of these crazy different stocks within such a small areas, because that's just what fish do. They stray. It's natural. And so this study is addressing this issue and saying, what's happening, what's the impact, and what can we do to mitigate the negative effects? And Patagonia should be, in my opinion, ashamed that they didn't even include something like that in there, because that film to me just presents this very doom and gloom, fear-mongering message, but it doesn't talk about the ongoing studies that are happening to address it. It doesn't address any counter opinions, and it doesn't present any solutions either. And so people need to eat, and you can't just take away something that employs thousands of people and feeds millions of people and not offer any solution.
I wanted to just kind of tap into that a little bit, not necessarily the film, but what do you see as maybe a couple of the biggest problems that salmon face, whether it's damming rivers or streams or just overfishing? Like, what are some of the things that you see? These are something that's critical, that if we don't figure this out, we're not going to be eating fish, or specifically salmon, much longer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I can certainly address the human impacts, but the biggest threat to salmon is warming oceans. And unfortunately, that requires a lot of people coming together to reduce our carbon footprint, and caring, I guess, about things that people don't necessarily want to care about. But, a lot of the damage that's been done on the West Coast was due to damming, habitat degradation. You can't just destroy the habitat that something needs to survive and expect it to carry on. It's just not going to happen. Overfishing is always a threat, but there's a lot of money and research that's poured into it, and people really do make a very conscious effort to minimize those impacts. The regulations in Alaska are so confusing that even people in the department sometimes have a hard time understanding them, and they change drastically from year to year and region to region. And so if I had to pick one single thing that threatens salmon more than anything, it would be, the environment they live in and that they spend their lives in and that they spawn in.
Detach from all of this, because your day-to-day actually involves studying this and seeing how the population is slowly declining. How do you detach from all of this and just enjoy life.
I know, it's hard. It's really hard. People have called me a pessimist. I would call myself a realist. It's like, yeah, it is really hard to study this stuff all the time. I think what I try and focus on is that we're actively doing things and working with people and collaborating to try and make it better. And so one of the things I really wanted from my life, we're always looking for new and exciting research to do to improve our evaluation techniques and our understanding of what's going on out there. I try and just focus on the fact that, at least at SSRAA and in Southeast Alaska, we're doing everything we can to help. And I think educating people is really important. And I need to personally do better about that, because outreach is not my forte. It's like, I'm a scientist. I just want to sit in my office and play with my Excel spreadsheets. But it's really eye-opening to see how much people care, especially in an area that really depends on salmon. But one conversation with one person can affect a lot of other people. And hatchery fish are meant to be caught. So I like to go out there and personally catch them, because I like to have fish in the freezer too. I like to, I'm a sport fisher. I like to enjoy the natural resources here. And so, yeah, I have to detach to a certain extent. Otherwise, the negativity is a little overwhelming. But having conversations with people is helpful, I think.
Yeah, well, thank you for having this conversation with us. Tess, we're going to lighten the mood so we can, I don't know, at least brighten up the end of the show a little bit. But Tessa has 2 dogs that probably help her detach a little bit too. One is the biggest dog I've ever seen. This is Bear Dog, and one is the teeniest dog I haven't seen it. It's too small to actually see with the naked eye. Seda.
Which is not true. You're exaggerating.
Maybe a little. I was wondering if you can share a story about Bear Dog and what Bear Dog is.
Well, what Bear Dog isn't is probably a better question. Bear Dog is a 100-pound Malamute Lab Husky mutt that was the last dog chosen out of his litter and the first dog to be rejected by its mom.
I know.
He has a ginormous head, probably the biggest head I've ever seen, really. And that's coming from someone who has a giant head. Bear Dog got his name because he goes out into the field with my fiance for about half the year each year. He grew up out there, so his town manners are not that good, but instinctually that dog is so smart. You probably wouldn't think so when he's digging up and eating human shit, but
oh god,
he really is.
That's what you do in the wild.
His job is to keep the bears away from camp, and so you'll hear him at all hours of the day and night, sometimes miles away, just barking. And he's got his bear bark. And there's even been times where one time he treed a black bear at camp, and the poor bear just wanted to get down and away, but Bear Dog was like having the best day ever. And so he had the bear treed, and then he would get tired and he'd have to go like get a drink of water, and then the bear would start coming down and he would just run back over there and bark at it and treat again. And so finally we had to like pull him inside and let the poor bear go. But he's faced off with brown bears, and he used to nip at their heels, and he's like spin master, so he can like ninja spin his way out of getting swatted. But we always said he's gonna probably go out because he faces a bear that doesn't want to deal with it. And I would say that's not a bad way to go if you've been raised in the woods. He's made it to, I think, 9 years now.
That sounds a little scary, though. I mean, when you're not used to it, looking at that can be a little bit like, no, my dog.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're It's like, no, he'll be fine. He's gonna just have a play date with a bear.
The bear's away from the people, so.
That's true.
Okay, so we know you love beer. So we'll test your knowledge and preferences. But you can't say just one brand. You have to like mention different depending on what you think would work, even if you have to make it up.
These are just your favorites for particular situations.
Okay, so we're gonna mention a situation and then you have to say, okay, this beer for whatever. Okay. So your favorite beer to drink when there's hot weather, like for hot weather.
For hot weather. Oh man. Well, you're going to see that we don't have a large selection of beer where I live. Like, it's pretty much Alaskan is all you've got.
Or a kombucha combination then. Be like, okay, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, when are you throwing down some White Claws?
Oh, yeah. If it's hot out and I'm on the boat, I'm probably going to be drinking White Claws or the Alaskan seltzers because ain't no laws when you're drinking the claws, right?
No, that's definitely not right.
And I have to confess, I didn't understand that one, but I'll laugh along.
Yesterday, it was hot out, and I mixed my Alaskan seltzer with my homemade kombucha, and it was incredible. So I might start doing that more.
Good.
All right. It's been a long day at work dealing with life. You come home, you open the fridge. What do you go for?
Oh, IPA for sure. Whatever's in there, I don't care. Just put it in my mouth.
That's great.
I love the Fremont Lush IPA, which I guess you wouldn't know what that's like, Timmy, or Carrots.
You fucked up. You're fired. No.
Start it over.
Yeah.
Okay, so favorite beer to drink when you're with friends?
When I'm with friends, well, I do love the Husky IPA. Also, Alaskan, again, not a lot of options up here.
Girl, we need to take you out of Alaska.
I know, huge shout out to Alaska.
Yeah.
I know. We need some competition. Actually, there's a lot of cool breweries up north, and there's two breweries in Ketchikan now, which is really exciting because we don't have a lot of options here as far as dining or activities.
What are they called? Let's get them some publicity.
Yeah, right. Bodden Street Brewing. Oh man, they specialize in saisons and Belgian beers. Delicious.
Bottom Street. What's the other one called?
Baleen Brewing. Yeah.
I mean, we don't drink, so we're here like poker face. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Why are we even asking this question? Okay. Okay, I guess the last one. And I'm asking this because I know some people drink like specific wine with a specific type of food. I don't know if this applies for beer, but like favorite beer to drink with food. Like what would you mix? What a good beer combination would be with a dish.
Let me give you a dish.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
So you just caught a gigantic halibut. Like you're grilling it. I think, do you grill halibut? Yeah, you're grilling the halibut. You got some asparagus with, I don't know, dill. Does that sound something? So we're going halibut, asparagus with some dill, and potato.
And one potato.
One Russian helicopter potato.
Well, that's a big meal for you. What would I drink? I'd probably drink an Elysian Space Dust.
I was going to say, she's going to say an Elysian Space Dust, so.
Yeah, you were right on there.
Let me say this, and we'll just kind of close up with a couple small things. We really didn't talk much about climbing, but Tessa, maybe you can come back on. We can talk a little bit more about some of your outdoor adventures. But Tessa's the first person to ever take me rock climbing. So there would not be a dihedral. There wouldn't be a podcast. Yeah. There wouldn't be any of this if it wasn't for Tessa. Her and I have climbed in lots of different states: Arizona, Alaska, Michigan, Hawaii, all over the place. But we'll get you back on, hopefully, Tess, and we can talk a little bit more about some of your adventures, including 175 kilometer race that you participate in. Insane.
Oh yeah.
So before we go, I just want to ask a couple questions. One, is there anything that you want to promote or anything that you think that listeners should know about or look into before we sign off?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention, if you're looking to be a sustainable consumer, there is a website called seafoodwatch.org. It's run by the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And I think they have an app as well. And it's not foolproof, but you can go on there if you're like at the grocery store or you're at a restaurant and you're like, oh, I see that they have orange rough-eye on the menu. I wonder if this is a sustainable fishery. And you can go on the app and type it in and it'll tell you either low, medium, or high risk. Like this is sustainable, this is semi-sustainable, or this is not, don't eat it. Which, by the way, if you ever see orange rough-eye, do not eat it.
Duly noted. That's amazing. What's the name of that again?
Seafoodwatch.org, I believe.
All right, perfect. And so,
the other thing I would say is there's a lot of like small scale fish processors in Alaska, and I'm sure Washington, Oregon, California, and these are people who are direct buying from fishermen. So it's not going to like these big processing plants. It's just going to small plants that are run by a few people. And a lot of those people will ship seafood to you right to your door, overnight shipping. And there's one in Ketchikan called Fish from Trish. There's another one in Juneau called Jerry's Seafoods. But if you just go online and Google like local fish, or I can find some more links to give you if people are interested in. But again, it's not cheap, but it's probably the best seafood you'll ever have compared to going out and catching it yourself and eating it that day. Because a lot of times this fish is extremely fresh. It's been handled by very few people, and the people that are handling it just care about their product so much. And so I'd really encourage people to support those types of businesses, especially people who like to eat a lot of seafood.
Tessa, thanks for sitting down and talking with us today.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was fun.
We'll have you on again soon.
Okay. Can't wait.
Bye. Thanks, Tess. That was so good.